everyone, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today is a very exciting video. I've already posted my favorite books of the year, so that can only mean one thing. We are talking about my least favorite books of the year. It's time to spill some tea on some reads that I encountered in 2019 that I personally did not love. Overall, I would say my reading year this past year was very strong. I read so many series that I loved so much, but I will say I did encounter some books that in my opinion were either just like okay, subpar, disappointing, or just all around bad. So today we're gonna be chatting through, I believe, the 5 or 6 books that have made this list. Before I dive into the books today, I do just want to quickly call out that opinions are subjective, so I might dislike or think a lot of these books are just okay, but that does not mean you're not allowed to love them and shout about them on the rooftops. Everyone has different opinions and feelings, and we all read and kind of digest books in different ways. So if your fave is on here, it's still your fave, it's totally fine, it just wasn't my fave. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. The first book I'm gonna chat about was actually the first book I read in 2019, and I was so disappointed by it, and that was Renegades by Marissa Mayer. This is a sci-fi superhero-centered YA story, and don't get me wrong, I thought the premise was particularly interesting. It basically follows a world where superpowers kind of like arose, and now the world and society are controlled by heroes in power, and there's also this kind of underground anarchist movement of heroes trying to like overthrow this power. We follow 2 main characters that kind of live on both sides. The premise is cool, but in my opinion, the execution just was not that great. Ultimately, I just thought there was not enough world building or kind of enough perspective and in-depth look at the politics of this world. I felt like everything was kind of surface, and the surface was interesting, but I just felt like there was so much potential in this story to go deep and to really uncover and discuss some really cool topics within this story. Because it had such a great setup, it just wasn't executed to like the level that I wanted it to be. That being said, I really just thought this book was okay. It fell pretty flat for me, and it was one that I was super anticipating, which I do not think helped it, because when I started it and I was like, oh, this is not as good as I thought it was gonna be. It was just all downhill from there. But this was the first book I read this year, and it definitely made my list. Next book I'm gonna chat about was also one of my most anticipated books of the year, and that was Wicked Saints. I've chatted about this book a lot on my channel this year in this capacity of how I was ultimately very disappointed by this book. But this is a dark YA fantasy novel that's kind of set in a Russia type setting. It's about 2 kingdoms who've been fighting for centuries, mostly due to religious differences. One side kind of practices blood magic, and the other side kind of uses powers from the divine themselves. Basically follow different sets of characters from either side. They've come together in this sort of, you know, mishmash of a way, and they're kind of on an adventure in this world. There's politics, there's betrayal, all of that jazz. I think the strength of this book is the magic system is interesting. The blood magic, while gruesome, has some like cool ideas. Same on the flip side with the divinity-based magic, so our main character can basically call on the wills of different gods, and these different gods grant her different powers. That was cool. Other than that though, I found so many issues with this book. One, I felt like the plot was very lackluster and very simple. I felt like we really had to buy into characters' relationships, both romantically and from a friendship perspective, very, very quickly. And because of that, I just did not buy anyone's relationships at all. I did not believe anyone was that close of friends. I did not believe people were so romantically angsty for each other. There just was not enough development between the characters to create stakes, which ultimately harmed the end plot as well. Because if there's no stakes, you don't really particularly care if anyone lives or dies, and you don't really understand the motivations to have characters like risk it all for someone they love or someone they're really close to from a friendship perspective. And on top of that, I did find the writing to be a little bit clunky, and it didn't really bring me into the story. Just in summary, I thought this book had great potential and just ultimately just was not very strong. While I found the magic was interesting, it could not make up for the shortcomings within the characters and the plot and the writing, which I really felt like were present within this story. Yeah, this was one I was super disappointed by because it was kind of a dark fantasy set in this Russian landscape, which is just a recipe usually for success for me, but this one just did not work for me this year, and I had to give it a low score. Probably one of my least favorites. But yeah, that also made my list. Next book I'm going to talk about is Sorcery of Thorns, which might be a little bit of a surprise. This is a book that started out so strong and then just took a nosedive, and I feel like has to make this list because while it was definitely entertaining and I still love Margaret Rogerson's writing, this book had huge plot issues for me. So this is a book that follows our main character who is growing up to be this warden. In this world, magic is contained within books, and there are people trained to basically protect the outside world from these magical books because if they're like tampered with, they turn into monsters and they go on rampages. Beginning of the story, our main character is framed for one of these occurrences, and she basically has to like work with a magician or a warlock to kind of clear her name. So strengths of this book are I love the writing style and the characters. I feel like Margaret Rogerson is great at that. She has very beautiful lyrical writing, and she really is great at creating dialogue and just kind of this romantic back and forth between characters. So that element of the story, very strong. I really, really liked that. But what makes me put this book on this list is just the plot. First and foremost, I would say the plot was very weird. Two big turning points, and they felt very disorienting because they were like separate from each other. So like you had a big plot twist and you had some exposition, but then there was another plot twist, and it was just kind of hard to wrap my mind around. On top of that, I would say the villain and just the overall plot line was very predictable. It was like we had a mustache twirling villain. It was honestly so surprising that the villain ended up being the villain because it just seemed so obvious from the beginning. I was expecting him to be a red herring, but he wasn't. It was the actual villain. And it almost just felt like this book had a really good idea, had really great characters, and then just the plot was sort of constructed haphazardly and thrown around them, because the strength of this was the characters and the writing. The weakness was the fantasy world building and the actual like plot dynamics. Because of that, I feel like this book had like sparks of greatness, but ultimately really disappointed me because I just felt like about halfway through, I felt like the plot just kind of fell apart, which really made me sad. But I have to chat about it. I have to be honest, and this worst books of 2019. Last two books are actually by the same author, and it's gonna be a surprise for everyone. This might be a little controversial, but the first one I have here is Queen of Nothing. This hurt me to put this on this list. Granted, again, this year was full of a lot of strong books, so picking my 5 least favorite books to talk about was hard. And this one was hard to include on this list, but it does in some ways deserve to be here. So this is one of my favorite series by Holly Black. This is a dark YA fae-centered story. We follow our main character Jude, who's human, and she's been raised in this fae world. There's this great angsty hate to love relationship, and Jude in the first one is kind of presented the opportunity to take some of the power back. Her whole life she's been tormented by the fae, so given this opportunity she can kind of finally get some revenge and get some power for herself. The first 2 books of this are incredible. This third book really let me down. I just felt like the whole plot was so condensed and none of it was really explored, and we also just had to like assume and just agree to things. Like a lot of stuff happened quote unquote off camera, and you just kind of were like had to accept it and then move on. So I just felt like for an end book, for the final book in this trilogy, we did not really get a plot that was satisfying or really had any stakes, because it lasted like 10 pages. Like the end plot was like, oh no, it's bad, but oh, it's resolved like almost immediately, because it was given no time to really develop. On top of that, I feel like we weren't really given a lot of the back and forth, which is honestly why I love this series so much between Jude and Carden. There just wasn't a lot of that in this series. Also, I feel like the payoff of their relationship, we weren't really given that really to its fullest. Like there should have been letters, there should have been more happening, but again, a lot of it happened off screen. And I just feel like this book could have been incredible if it was like 600 pages long. If it was just given the legs to be more robust, it would have been great. But instead, we got a really rushed plot and final book to an otherwise amazing series. I would give this like a 2.75 out of 5 stars. It's by no means like a book I hate. It's more a book that I look at with like sadness and disappointment because I wanted it to be amazing and it just was not. And the last book I'm going to talk about is the only book this year I DNF'd. It's the only book I DNF'd that I got far enough to qualify as a DNF. I often read books that I just never mention, where I read like 20 to 30 pages and I'm like, oh, this isn't for me, and I just get rid of it. Maybe I'll make a video about those books another day. It's a book I read 100 pages and DNF'd, and I did not like it. It's probably the worst book I attempted to read this year, and that is Tithe, also by Holly Black. So I tried to read this original fae-centered trilogy before Queen of Nothing came out, but it was just too early 2000s for me. Oh my gosh, what a throwback this book was. I can't even really articulate what this book was about, but like just imagine the kind of setting that we got in 2007. There was a lot of cigarettes, there was a lot of angst, there was a lot of like weird aggression between characters and like very unrealistic high school scenarios where people are, I don't know, like hijacking cars and hanging out in abandoned roller coasters. Like it was so it's like a time warp, and it just was not for me. I could not get into the writing or the characters or the time and place. And I asked a lot of you guys, like, does this get better? Should I just keep trying? And everyone was like, no, just give it up. And I was like, all right, I'm gonna do that. So this is why I DNF'd this book. It just was not for me. It was almost like whiplash. I like picked this up and I was like, whoa, I have not read something like this in like 15 years. What do I do? I DNF'd Tithe, did not finish it, and that is the last book I'm gonna talk about in this video. Alrighty guys, hopefully you guys enjoyed my worst books of 2019. Let me know down below some books you read this year that you ultimately were disappointed by, as I would love to know, and I will see you guys soon with another video soon. Goodbye.